coming to our panel today. My name is Iskra Gencheva and I teach at Lakeland College, Japan, and I hope to teach at Lakeland University, Japan, which will be very soon. I'm the moderator of this panel today, and I just want to make sure that everybody is in the right place and you're interested in seeing the global classroom. This is our topic, right? We have three fascinating presentations and from three universities in Japan. One is Luke Lawrence, and he's from Yokohama City University. One is Sachi Banks from Bunkyo University, and the third one is Sarah Sanderson from International Christian University. So welcome all of you, and we are looking forward to listening to your presentations. Each presenter has about 20 minutes, and questions and answers will be after finishing all three presentations, so please hold your questions. One announcement to make: after we finish here, we have student symposium, which is just downstairs, and I hope that all of you can join this symposium. Our students will talk at that time. So, first presentation is Luke's presentation, so this is now your time.
Thank you. Okay, hello. I'm Luke Lawrence from Yokohama City University, and in this presentation, I've called it Reassessing Translation Skills for the Global Age. I'm going to be talking about the idea of using simple translation activities in university classes, but I'm also going to use it to include, in general, use of the students' L1 in class, and the acceptability or the benefits of that. And I hope that by the end of the presentation, you'll at least change your thinking a little bit, or maybe begin to challenge a little bit of the received wisdom about how and what we should teach. The inspiration for the presentation is really just my own experience and working at different stages of the kind of language learning process in Japan. I worked for 5 years teaching business English exclusively, and a lot of my students were new graduates, and I saw the kind of skills they needed and the kind of skills they had, and I saw there was a big discrepancy. I also spent 3 years working for the British Council as a team teacher, as they called it, an ALT in a junior high school, and I saw the skills which they had learned, and then how then they were transferred or not transferred into other spheres. And for the last few years I've been working at the university level and seeing how the classes that are taught there and the skills that the students are given. And it just seems to me there seems to be some kind of disconnect along the way, and I'm afraid to say the university level seems to be where it's going wrong. And I think part of this is the insistence on the monolingual ideal and things like that. So I'm going to be talking about that today. Okay, first of all, let's get a little bit of background. So as far as we know, for centuries, millennia even, people learned languages by translating, and as far as we know, they did it pretty successfully. But 100 years or so ago, we've got the reform movement that came in, giving the idea that the medium of the instruction should be in the L2. This was very quickly followed by the direct method, which was a much more dogmatic approach. They insisted upon monolingual classrooms, and in many cases insisted upon native teachers to deliver these monolingual lessons. Of course, by the 70s, we've got communicative language teaching, where any kind of reference to grammar is completely taken away, and people are putting the emphasis on communicating. Nowadays, a lot of people use the task-based language teaching model, the new variant of CLT, basically, where people are using these communication activities for, allegedly, some kind of purpose. So this is where we're at now. So in all of this, where is translation? Well, as Cook says, it's not that translation was considered, assessed and rejected with reasons given for that rejection, but rather it was simply ignored. It wasn't really vilified, it just doesn't exist. You check the literature, it's not there. You pick up a history of SLA or whatever, check the index, it's not in there. What happens to translation? Why are people ignoring it? Well, we don't really know, but since the turn of this century, there's been a resurgence in translation. I'm just going to go through, I've kind of cherry-picked some of like the key papers and the key people in this We've got Holiday talking about native speakerism. He was one of the first people to challenge the idea of the superiority of the native speaker and to bring attention to the fact that community of language teaching was basically a Western ideal being forced in this one-size-fits-all package onto every country in the world, where it didn't necessarily fit. As Sullivan put it, CLT represents Anglo-centric culture, Anglo-centric build of communication, and these values are being exported to part and parcel of CLT methodologies. And it's starting to be questioned. Macro did some interesting work on code switching, trying to empirically prove that using the student's L1 in the classroom was not detrimental, and in fact could be very valuable. As he concluded, the fact that bilinguals can code switch is an asset and a valuable addition to their array of communication strategies. So referring to your own language, he saw as a communication strategy. Pennycook did some interesting work in 2008. She put a more philosophical slant on it, thinking about language as kind of like the global traffic of language moving around the world, and how if we don't have translation, we're kind of excluded from this. As she put it, it allows us to open up and explore the many possible meanings that can start to flow in and out of languages in relation to. 2010, we've got Guy Cook's Translation in Language Teaching. It's pretty much the first substantial book to put all of these ideas together. To be honest, it reads slightly dogmatically at times, but he argues pretty convincingly for kind of empirically how the ideas about translation and using L1 can and should be used. He also kind of refers to the commercial aspect, the ideas that the big publishing houses had a very big advantage in keeping it monolingual. And he said translating should be a major aim and means of language learning and a major measure of success, which is interesting. I'm going to come back to this later, but the idea that we are measuring our students as in their ability to be monolingual, they're always going to fail. They're not going to be monolingual, they're not going to be native speakers. He gives the idea that we should be evaluating them on their ability to use both languages. So we're seeing our students as these failed monolinguals, but in fact we should be seeing our students as basically partly successful bilinguals, but we're not, because we're only evaluating them on our monolingual and bilingual. Leonardi did some interesting work, 2010-2011. She highly valued translating, calling it the fifth skill, thinking it should be part of the curriculum, that's how important it is. She also says it's a natural thing. If you're referring to your own language, you can't get around that. You can pretend it doesn't exist, but it does. She calls it a naturally occurring cognitive, linguistic and communicative learning activity to be promoted rather than neglected. Or in the case of a lot of university programs and classes and even policies, actively suppressed this kind of referring to the L1. And finally, just the last few years, we've got something called the multilingual term. It's called at the moment. It might be called something different in a couple of years' time. But again, they're challenging the idea of the monolingual bias. And they're also challenging the idea that the world is divided up into one language at a time. You know, the world these days is multilingual. In houses, families, schools, offices, around the world, people are communicating in more than one language all at the same time. The world doesn't exist in these separate little holes. As Conte and Copland and Crease said, it's becoming more and more difficult, indeed unhelpful, to consider languages as separate at all. We need to see how they refer to each other. Okay, we've got this far, and we haven't really talked about what is translation. Well, I'm going to go to Cook again. He says translation involves a transfer of meaning from one language to another. So if we see it in these broad terms, we can start to see how it might be useful in our classes. And one thing, if this is what it is, one thing which it isn't, and I think this is probably why people are so resistant to the idea of translation, I think a lot of people confuse translation with grammar translation, the methodology of mechanically translating word for word inauthentic, disconnected text, which was widely discredited, and in many cases rightly so. But for anyone that's worked in Japan, especially in the secondary school sector, or in many other countries, translation is going on. It's never stopped. It's gone underground almost. It's happening in the classroom. It's just in the literature. It's as if it didn't exist. And in Japan, we've got the Japanese version of grammar translation, which is yakudoku. Very different from traditional grammar translation. It uses reasonably authentic connected texts. And Saito found in his study of yakidoku in Japan that in fact it was a mixture of construing, parsing, interpretation and translation on the part of the students. And if that's not language learning, I don't know what is. I mean, that's how you learn a language. You construe, you parse, you interpret. And this is what was happening in the junior high schools and in the high schools in Japan. But this is using a methodology which has been vilified in the mostly Western-centric journals and things like that. I did a study, it was smaller than Saito's, of secondary school Japanese teachers in Tokyo. I observed lots of classes, I interviewed the teachers, and I found pretty much the same thing. This is what was going on. At the junior high school level, it was mainly speaking and listening. The activities were interactive, they were real time. So they started from single lexical items, building up into chunks and phrases and sentences, and they were building up this ability, and the students were engaged, they were enjoying it, and for me it was like real-time interpretation, which I thought was a very good skill. And I should say, I went into my study with the opposite opinion. I came to find the big bad grammar translation. And when I sat down and watched it, it was the opposite of what I expected. These were interesting, fun, useful ideas that were being learned very well. But I think they're not quite enough. I mean, the problem with yakidoku on the other side is it gives you up to a certain point, but there's still a lot of emphasis on accuracy and there being one correct answer and things like that, which are not quite appropriate for university level, which a lot of us are teaching. So, but they basically spent the last 6 years building up these skills of being able to interpret and parse and switch between languages, but they get to university and what happens? The non-native speaker is not always, but very often replaced by a native speaker. The focus on form is replaced by a focus on function. The exam focus is changed either to communication focus or what is sometimes cheekily referred to as English for no special purpose, which a lot of university programs, I don't know what they're teaching. The grammar translation of the yakidoku gets replaced by the CIT, and the bilingual classroom, where they've been honing their skills, is replaced by a monolingual classroom. Now, the problem not is only the big shock to the system of this change, but the fact that all of these skills that they've been building up and learning are suddenly disregarded and made to seem as if they're not important and not useful. And I think, as well as being demotivating and demeaning to the students, it doesn't really help us as teachers. Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit now. What are some possible arguments against using teaching translation in university classes? Well, according to the literature, the main objections seem to be there's less L2 output if you're using the L1. It's boring, it's mechanical, it's inauthentic, it's not communicative, there's a lack of equivalence. You can't sometimes you can't translate correctly. It's difficult to implement, if the teachers don't know the language of the L1, it's very difficult, and it doesn't prepare the students for the real world. Well, I'd just like to counter these one by one. Less L2 output, there's no evidence of this at all. In fact, Makaro's code switching work, he found that there was absolutely no difference at all between the amount of English actually produced when the L1 was used and when it wasn't in the classroom. In fact, he argues that insisting on monolingualism makes more teacher-focused classes and more teacher talking time because they're having to convolutedly explain in a very long, drawn-out way something that is very simple, when in fact they could be just referring to the L1 and getting overdone with or using other students to refer to the L1 and making it more student-focused. So monolingual classrooms, in fact, take time away from the students and focus it on the teacher. The idea that it's boring and mechanically inauthentic, again, I think this seems to stem from the idea of the confusion between translation and grammar translation. Grammar translation is possibly boring, mechanical and inauthentic, but there's no reason why translation activities need to be. They can be fun, they can be things that students are interested in. You can use authentic materials to get them to translate. There's no reason why that needs to be the case. Not communicative, I'm going to put these together, not communicative and lack of equivalence. For me, lack of equivalence is definitely true, but I see it as possibly the number one asset of translation because it involves critical thinking. When you have to translate from one language to another, there's a range of options that you can choose when you're deciding which phrase or what word to use. And what they're having to do is engage their critical faculties, which at university level, that's what they should be doing. That's what we should be getting them to do as university teachers. And this goes along with negotiation of meaning. If there's a range of things to choose from, they're going to have to negotiate in their groups, even within their own brain, the correct meaning. Difficult to implement? Yes, but possible. I'm going to come back to this. Doesn't prepare students for the real world. Not true at all. I'm going to come back later, but just for now, it's needed in study, business, and personal life. I'm also going to add to this that translation gives learners greater scope for student-generating new language if they're the ones that are producing these new words by translating them. They're doing it by themselves, and they're more likely to retain the language. If we just spoon-feed them vocabulary and gap fills, there's not any reason for them to remember this. If they're generating it themselves, they can retain it better. Global comprehension. I don't know about you, but when I give students reading tasks, they're great at the gap fills, they're great at scanning to find the answer. When they're asked to give a summary, they usually mutter under their breath in Japanese or ask their partner who explains it to them in Japanese. And that's natural. If we want to understand the whole, we refer to our own language. To stop them doing it, we're kind of stopping them halfway through before they've fully understood what they're reading. Back to individual interpretation, critical thinking. It promotes autonomy. It gives them the confidence to make decisions about language, which is often missing from the monolingual classroom. I think which is a vital skill to be a university student. And finally, and more importantly, access to their own knowledge and identity. These are university students. They're not stupid. They're intelligent specialists in their field. A lot of them are studying difficult subjects. But when they come into the English classroom, they're almost infantilized, they're reduced to banal topics like hobbies and food when they're experts on nuclear physics. And I think that's not fair. If we allow, because the reason is because they can't do it monolingually. They can only do that monolingually. But if they're allowed access to their own language, then think of the possibilities of how we can teach them, how we can help them. Not only that, but it's their identity as well. And asking them to leave their Japanese identity at the door, I think, is a little bit unfair. So real world, university. Yeah, they need it right now. How many? Five, okay, good. They need these skills right now. I've noticed, especially my science students, what they're doing. They're reading papers in English, usually because a lot of academic papers are in English. They're reading these often very difficult papers in English. They're going away and they're writing a report in Japanese for their Japanese professor. And they're expected to somehow be able to do this without having the training to be able to do it. In business, again, we teach our students negotiation skills. They might do some discussion, but we're still living in a hierarchical culture. When they graduate from university, they're not going out to New York and negotiating $50 million deals. They're 23 years old. It's not going to happen. If they're lucky, they're in the office in Tokyo making photocopies. If they're really lucky, they might be preparing the bilingual document for the $50 million deal. If they're super lucky, they're accompanying their senior boss out to New York to help to interpret for him. Whatever, they need these skills. And the most likely, what I found when I was teaching business English, the most common situation was the students had a Japanese boss who they were getting instructions from. They were going back to their desk and writing an email in English to their counterpart in Paris or London. They were getting the email back in English and they were going back to their boss and telling them what the email had said in Japanese. So the whole time they were needing to switch and translate and interpret. And again, they hadn't got these skills at university. They hadn't been given these skills. We've got global media. Basically the internet is English pretty much. And if we want students to interact with the world, they need to be able to get this information from English and reinterpret it for their own culture. And finally, international lives. Most people perhaps won't live abroad or whatever, but you don't know. You know, when I was a university student, I couldn't imagine that I'd be living in Japan with a Japanese wife and a bilingual child. And not everyone's going to have that, but maybe their brother will, or their aunt, or their friend, or whatever. People live international lives. Okay, so let's be realistic. Is it implementable? It's difficult, but I'm going to say yes. I mean, we've got online resources, there's official translation, there's subtitle media, we can use all of this. It's right there on the internet. Peer review, so there's usually a mix of levels in the classes. Get the students to help each other, get the communication going, negotiate the meetings. Collaborate with other teachers. You know, we're university teachers, we're so isolated. We go into our class and we don't really share even our ideas. If you've got a teacher in the faculty that has different language skills to you, get together. And I would say, for any native speakers here, have a bit more confidence in your own ability. I think we're constantly told by the literature, etc., how monolingual we are and how monocultural we are. We're not. Your Japanese or your student C1 doesn't have to be perfect. With a bit of preparation, there's no reason why you can't do some simple translation activities and maybe have a bit more confidence to use a bit more of the language which you learn in your classes. And on the bigger scale, I suppose, just urging universities to review their monolingual policies. Just think about how it affects the teachers and the students. Okay, so just to finish off, just to leave you to think about when you're on the train home or planning your classes on a Monday morning, is it desirable or even possible to suppress the natural tendency to refer to the L1? Should we see our students as failed monolinguals or partly successful bilinguals? What do we mean when we say bilingual? Can or should languages always be separated into these boxes? What skills do university students actually need after they graduate? And what simple translation activities can we incorporate into our lessons? Just for you to think about after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.